Good afternoon, everyone. We're going to be starting in just 1 minute. So, as we start, I'll introduce myself. Um, my name is Sandro Prusa. I'm the Chief Executive Officer, CEO of the Ontario Society of Professional Engineers, and very happy to serve in that capacity to represent the engineering community to our stakeholders. As the advocacy body for engineers in Ontario, OSPE creates spaces for engineers to discuss matters where engineers excel in and collaborate on solutions. Well, really, that's what we do. I don't come up with the solutions. The staff don't come up with solutions. What the organization does is create areas for collaboration, and we bring engineers together to share with them an issue, a problem, that the Ontario government or Canadian government or society in general is facing. And we ask our members to weigh in and share their knowledge and experience and thoughts and opinions so that we can review these and then formulate it into coherent dialogue and with some really straightforward recommendations that we go to government with. And then we advocate that on your behalf. So the OSPE staff and myself are all registered lobbyists. So we have the ability to officially represent these ideas to the government and to the various stakeholders, not only in Ontario, but across Canada. And it's I guess, an obligation we take seriously and something that we're very proud to do on behalf of Ontario's engineering community. So today, one of the spaces by which we do this is our task forces. Our task forces are made up of our members who have a tremendous amount of experience and knowledge on various areas. So today we're talking about energy. So our energy task force is made up of experts who've worked in this field for many, many years, have actually worked to design Ontario's energy system, and therefore are very knowledgeable of how it works, where the deficiencies are, but also members of our task force are in some emerging areas of our energy. So how do we transition from a high carbon energy system to a low carbon and eventually net zero energy system? How do we do that in a way that is based on science and engineering? So that's what we do. Today, we were hoping to have our task force chair, Steve Pepper, join us, but he unfortunately was called away to a meeting last minute, literally 15 minutes before our event was supposed to start. But fortunately, we have Paul Accioni, who will be joining us. And Paul is a current member of our task force. He was a past chair of the task force. As well, he served in many capacities on the OSPE board, including as past chair and president, so past chair of the board and president of OSPE. So we're very lucky to have Paul join us. Paul is just logging in as I speak, and we'll be sharing a lot of the work that the Energy Task Force is doing. Now, I can also share with you, because I'm sure it'll be up in our conversation, last Monday, so a week ago today, actually, I was invited, or sorry, last Tuesday, I apologize. I was invited, or OSPE was invited, to attend a stakeholder session with an energy called Energy Transition Canada. And they've been awarded a contract to do these consultations right across the country to hear from various stakeholders on how does Canada get to a net zero position on our energy by 2050. So again, there were 24 stakeholders in a room, stakeholders from various groups in this space, including OSPE, but we also had stakeholders from ISO, we had stakeholders from Hydro One, from OPG, from Enbridge Energy, from academia as well were in the room. So people who are studying the energy system, and then various consultants, and for example, the Ontario Power Producers Association was in there as well. So it was a very unique stake of stakeholders, and we all shared our ideas on how we get to net zero by 2050, whether it's actually possible and whether it's affordable, and what the various roles of various groups and technologies are involved in that. So that's some of the work that OSPI does on this front. I'm very fortunate to have Paul Accioni join us representing OSPI. Hello, Paul. How are you? Oh, I can't hear you, Paul. Can you hear us?
Hi, Sandra.
Hi, how are you, Paul?
Not too bad. You're coming in awfully low on volume. I don't know why.
Okay, I'll try to speak up. Usually, my grade 1 and 2 teacher told me I had no problem with speaking. In fact, she kept telling me to stop talking and interrupting the class. So,
Yeah.
so the fact that you're having trouble hearing me is a unique situation for me. So, Paul, I explained how you're stepping in to replace Steve, who was called away last minute. So, eternally grateful for your ability to do that. So, first off, why don't you introduce yourself? So, who is Paul Accioni, and a little bit about your experience in the energy system?
Yeah, sure. So I graduated from the University of Toronto way back when, longer than I'd like to remember. And uh, and then I joined Ontario Hydro. At that time, it was an integrated utility, and then stayed with the Ontario Power Generation Company when they split it up into pieces. Most of my career was spent on fossil and nuclear generating stations, and near the end, I was involved in simulation and analysis of the power stations and how they integrate into the power grid, so that they don't destabilize things and operate nicely with everything else. And then I retired, and I spent a little bit of time every so often on OSPI energy policy stuff.
Okay, that perfect transition to my next question. Then it's like I sent these ahead of time for you to review, and we didn't because you're last minute substitution. So tell me why. I mean, you're a tremendous amount of knowledge and experience, and that your time is extremely valuable. I know you also do some consulting on the side as well. So why do you spend some time volunteering with OSPI?
Well, I like to think that by influencing the government in coming up with better energy policy will make life a little better, not just for the engineers that work in the energy sector, but also engineers that work in sectors that use a lot of electricity. One of the problems we had for a number of years was electricity rates were going up much faster than inflation because of poor energy policy. And so I thought that by contributing some of my expertise, we can convince the government there's a better way to run a railroad, if you pardon the expression. And so far they've been listening. It takes them a while. The government doesn't move very quickly because they have to consult with all the stakeholders before they do anything that you ask them to do. But they have incorporated a lot of our recommendations over the years, and as you can see now, the electricity rates in Ontario are not so bad. They're not going up faster than inflation, and we're making better use of the clean stuff when it's available, rather than dumping it as we were doing in from the 2014 to about 2020 period. But unfortunately, if you go to net zero, which is the next plan, the amount of surplus clean electricity is going to increase again. And so we've been working with the government recently to try to convince them to put some policies in place so that that clean surplus electricity can be used at its market price, which is very low, to do other things with it, like improve heating, so that we don't have to burn fossil fuels, use the clean electricity for that at very low prices overnight. And in very shortly, they're coming out with an overnight plan, which is going to make the price of electricity at night very low, which will encourage the use of surplus electricity at night for things like heating and charging electric vehicles and maybe making hydrogen.
Excellent. And I know we had our Queen's Park Day on February 28th. I know yourself and Steve and the OSPI policy leads met with the Minister of Energy. He spoke at a reception too, and was very complimentary of the work that OSPI's been doing in this file. And I can tell you and tell the members as well that he's very appreciative, and we have a tremendous relationship with the Ministry of Energy, ongoing meetings where they really are listening to us and have taken our advice in the past. So that's fantastic. And you did talk about net zero. So I know there are a lot of things that the Energy Task Force works on. There's boundless areas that we can go in when we talk about energy and getting to net zero and so forth, and pricing and policy. So how does the task force, let's peel back the curtain a bit, or open the curtain a bit. How does the task force actually decide on what areas to get involved in?
Well, we get together once a month and over Zoom or Teams, whichever, and we discuss some issues that we individually think are important, and then collectively we decide which initiative will move forward. So there's different topics that are priorities at different times. Right now, or last year, we were pushing the low overnight rate to try to suck up some of that surplus energy. And now that the government's rolling out that program, we're trying to encourage them to fine tune the numbers a little bit, because the numbers that the OEB selected are not very attractive to the average consumer. We think they can do better. So one of the items that we picked up at the meeting with the minister recently was, can you ask the OEB to tweak the numbers a little bit, because they're a little, I think it's going to scare, the numbers that they're planning to come out with are going to scare some people not taking the new plan. And the average person in the public doesn't know how to do the fancy math to show that the plan is good for them. So they look at the price and then decide whether it's worth joining. And if the prices aren't aligned properly with the average person's thinking, then they're not going to join the plan, and we won't have the kind of take up that we want, so that we can suck up that clean energy. So that's something the minister said he would follow up on and see what the OEB would do in tweaking the numbers. So that was an immediate need right now. But going forward, I think we're going to start focusing a little more on what net zero looks like in the future. We just issued a report. The task force issued a report recently on what energy would cost in the future if we use different supply mixes to achieve net zero. And the minister was quite interested in those results. We had a chat about it. And he wanted a little bit more information about what some of the plans that are being submitted to his office would look like. I think he was hoping that we would run some analysis for him on the costs, because he wants to be sure the costs are being reflected honestly, and that people aren't making favorable assumptions in the analysis. One of the problems in calculating the costs of a net zero system is you have to get pretty good at estimating the amount of surplus power that's going to be curtailed, the amount of backup generation that's required when the clean stuff is not available. Typically solar and wind, when it disappears, how much backup do you need? And also some other issues associated with the amount of transmission to move that energy back and forth between the generating plants and storage and the customer. And a lot of people use very optimistic assumptions that make their particular proposal look very attractive. And then when you run the numbers honestly, you get some very different numbers. So he was quite surprised at the numbers we were generating for some of the things that he thought were going to be a lot cheaper. And then we explained to him why that was going to cost more, and he was a little surprised. He said, well, why aren't those numbers coming out the same with the other people? I said, because they're making optimistic assumptions about what's really going to happen. When you're designing the system and operating the system, you're not really interested in favoring any particular energy source. You're trying to do the analysis on a best estimate basis of what really will happen in the future. So he was quite interested in seeing what we would generate on some of the numbers where he was getting
Good.
very much more favorable numbers from other people.
I'm happy somebody's eating those eggs. I was hoping.
If we
I
ask
did-
the participants to mute themselves in the background, and will there be a good opportunity? Actually, it's a great opportunity for me to mention it right now. I was planning on doing that. So in a few minutes, we're going to open up the discussion to our task force members to ask questions. We asked you to put your questions in the chat, and then I'll read them out to Paul for Paul to answer, or for me to answer if you have that. So please put your questions or comments in the chat. And if you want to say something, if you want to actually make a comment as well, just put in the chat that you'd like to make a comment. And then at that time, I'll recognize you and we can unmute you, and then you can ask that question. Okay. So great, Paul. You're talking about getting to net zero. And I was sharing with the group, I was at a meeting last week where there were, not getting into the actual pricing, but talking about what some of the challenges are to get to net zero, and the opportunities as well. And that. So I'm glad we're ready there, that OSPI's kind of leading in the front there to have those discussions. And you did make a really important point there that we are technology agnostic, right? We look at all the technologies, and we look at, if the priority is costs, then let's be serious about the cost, and let's realize what getting to net zero is going to be, so that you can have that transparent conversation. And I think you're right that, you've got to, you can't base it on hope. Hope is never a strategy. It's always based on what can be done and what can be done now, and recognize that as new technologies may come in the forefront, and as new things start to develop, that may start to change your analysis, but you can't develop a plan based on unknowns, right? You got to develop your plan based on what you know, and then as you start to get there, perhaps then things start to change. So, you're talking about the various costing and the various options forward. What are some of the limitations, or I guess some of the unknowns that are really hampering that long-term energy plan?
Well, I think when people look at net zero, they have a tendency to pick their favorite energy source, and then when they do the analysis, they don't actually take the hourly variation of the energy source they have and the hourly variation of the load that they're going to see, and put them together. It's a complicated analysis, and most people like to simplify things. So what they do is they average. They take 4 or 5 years, they average them out, and then they get a typical year. Well, when you do that, you eliminate all the tails in the distribution. You eliminate the periods when there's too much surplus clean energy. You eliminate the periods when there isn't enough clean energy. And if you eliminate the tails, the numbers come out quite different, because then you don't need as much backup, you don't need as much curtailment, and you don't need as much transmission. And so the numbers are very, very optimistic. And so they think they've got a wonderful plan ready to go, and they don't realize, but in real life, it's not going to work out that way. When the sun disappears for a 3 or 4 day storm, you've got to deliver enough energy for 4 days to keep the lights on, and 4 hours of storage is not going to do it. Most of these renewable people are putting 4 hours of storage in their batteries. Well, what can you do with 4 hours in a 4 day winter storm? Well, when you put in 4 days of battery storage in there, the numbers will blow your brains out. So then you need a different kind of backup. You need a backup that's not energy limited like a battery. And then that means you have to go to renewable natural gas at 5 times the price of current fuel, or you have to go into hydrogen, which is even more expensive, or biofuels, which is also very expensive. And then when you put those numbers in, you say, oh my God, how come it's coming out so expensive? Well, it's because you're trying to keep the lights on so you don't kill people.
Yeah, and that is a unique, sorry, I'm going to jump in. That is a unique issue too with energy. there is a societal need applied to it. It's not an option, right? Everyone needs energy, because if the energy system fails, and it fails for a significant amount of time, people die. And we saw that in Texas with their gas grid or their energy grid when it froze. So that is a unique point, that this isn't something that can be experimental. It needs to be realistic. And you wanted to add to that?
No, that was basically the point I was making. Is you cannot average out the tails of the distribution. You have to deal with the tails on an hourly basis. And if that loss of energy occurs for 3 or 4 or 5 days, you've got to survive the entire period. Otherwise, you're going to kill people. And that changes how you package up the generation. You can't use batteries for everything, because the batteries are too expensive when you get up into the 3, 4, 5 day period. So that changes what kind of generation you can use that's not energy limited. And there's very few clean generation sources that are not energy limited. And some of them, like hydroelectric and nuclear, are very expensive. So you don't want to build too much hydro and too much nuclear to handle a winter event that occurs only 1 day a year, because those plants have to be capitalized and the debt paid for. And so it's not easy to combine the various generation in such a way that you keep both the emissions and the costs at a reasonable level.
Excellent.
I mean, that's the art of system design, which unfortunately, a lot of people that don't have the engineering knowledge and background and experience think they can design an electrical system using Google. I mean, it's not going to happen. You gotta have the engineering education and knowledge to know how to handle these extreme events, and how are you going to package up the architecture so that you don't actually end up with a loss of power and a potential loss of life.
I'd like to just pick your brain on 2 other issues and 2 other topics, and then we'll open up the floor to questions. And there's already 1 question in there. So the first thing is these SMRs. What's OSFI's position on it, and where do you see them as part of our energy mix in the future?
Sorry, what was that question? I missed the word.
Oh, the small modular nuclear reactors. Where
the small modular. Well, the small modular reactors are currently in the development phase. So while the easier to license options like the PWRs and the BWRs that are being modularized are probably going to be licensed successfully, some of the more exotic SMR designs that are more fuel sustainable with lower radioactive wastes, they're much more difficult to license, and it will take a little bit of longer period. So I think with the small modular reactors, we're going to go through 2 or 3 phases of development, where the easy ones get licensed first, but they're not fuel sustainable. And then later, as the technology evolves, then we'll get to more sustainable cycles with less radioactive waste and better use of the fuel. Right now, nuclear reactors only use about 1% of the uranium before the fuel gets contaminated and it goes into a storage area. So we'd like to get that up to 90, 95, maybe even 99%, but it requires a different kind of reactor technology. So that's going to take a little while. So I think we're going to have to put our minds into a space where we know we're going to have to do it in steps. And the initial step will be the typical BWR, PWR modularized small modular reactors so that we can get them going. The other thing is if we design them to be relatively passively safe, which means that they will not release major radioactive releases to the environment, then you can move these small modular reactors closer to industrial parks and commercial parks, and then they can supply thermal energy for space heating and water heating into the city, which is one of the areas that we don't have a very good solution at net zero. Most of the net zero solutions for space heating and water heating involve very expensive hardware or very expensive fuels. And if we can get the thermal energy from these small modular reactors to get close enough to the urban areas to supply the hot water and space heating, it would make life so much easier to decarbonize the buildings in the urban areas. In the rural areas, we can probably do it with heat pumps and electric resistance heaters, but it would take too much electrical generation to do that if we did the same philosophy in the cities. We'd have to triple the size of our electrical system if we all went to heat pumps and baseboard heaters for the really cold days. So it's really important to look at the cost of these various net zero options for the various types of energy we use, like for transportation, for heating, and for electricity, and pick the best architecture that results in the overall lowest cost net zero. Otherwise, we're going to have very high electricity costs that will make us uncompetitive worldwide and will destroy our industrial economy. So it's really important that we do this right if we don't want to lose our standard of living over the next 20 years.
Okay, and then the last question is with respect to distributed energy resources, DERs. You know, so I know that's, people are saying, well, that could be a solution. What's OSPI's position on those?
Well, the distributed energy sources typically they're intermittent, like solar and wind, and so you need either a backup or a storage scheme that will work. Storage is very expensive if you get into extended periods of time. So yes, they can be part of the solution, but they can only do certain jobs unless you've got a lot of money. So they're better for short-term substitution of fossil fuels rather than long-term substitution of fossil fuels, because they require too much storage and too much backup generation if you want to handle large continent-wide storms that come through from time to time. So yes, they're part of the solution, but they can only go so far before it gets extremely expensive if you rely on them too heavily.
Okay, thanks, Paul. We're going to get to the questions from the audience now. We have 3 so far. The first one, and we've alluded to it, but maybe you can expand on it. Have you considered heating loads and what it would take to electrify those, considering the hourly and seasonal variations in heating, especially in Canada?
Yeah, well, we didn't do the analysis in detail. We did a back of the envelope estimate. We figured it would triple the size of the electrical grid, but it would only deliver about double the amount of energy. This was back of the envelope, but the IESO recently did a very detailed hour by hour analysis, and they came up with very similar numbers, about tripling the size of the electrical grid and doubling the amount of energy that's delivered, which inherently means the cost of electricity is going to be much higher because you've put in extra capacity and you're not using it. You're only using that extra capacity for the coldest days in the winter. The rest of the time it's sitting there doing nothing. Mm-hmm. So it's again, really important that we ask ourselves, well, are there any other options? And one option that has not been looked at in North America, and certainly not by the IESO, is thermal networks, which are very popular in Europe. Thermal networks use heat from industrial waste heat, whether it's for generating electricity or doing high temperature operations in industry, or commercial operations that reject a lot of heat, like data centers, crypto mining centers, refrigeration buildings for ice cream and other stuff. They reject a lot of heat 12 months of the year. And so if you have a thermal network, people can put their rejected heat into that thermal network, and other people can take heat out of that network, and you get a much lower cost per delivered joule of energy using a thermal network rather than using an electrical system. Because remember, electricity is very expensive because the process of making electricity is capital intensive and it's not very efficient thermodynamically. So it's better if you want heat to start with heat rather than to make electricity and then convert it back to heat. So the Europeans, I think, are the sort of world leaders in this. And I think because they've had energy prices higher than North America for many, many decades, they've developed those thermal networks. And I think we can learn a lot from the Europeans, particularly their new generation 4 and generation 5 low temperature district heating systems. Those low temperatures district heating systems allow you to store thermal energy for weeks at relatively low cost, much cheaper than electrical energy storage. So I think from the point of view of heating at low temperature, which is like space and water heating, the thermal networks would make a better economic package to achieve net zero in the cities. Now, outside of the cities is a different story because you can't build a lot of piping underground in a sparse area. It's too expensive. So outside of the city, you'd be using more either ground source or air source heat pumps with backup resistance heaters. And as long as there's not too many homes in the rural area, then that will not be too expensive. But the major cities, I think we need a different solution, and the thermal networks, I think, will turn out to be the silver bullet. The Europeans are already moving in that direction, and I think by the time energy prices start to drift up because of carbon taxes or other reasons, it'll become economic also in Canada. So we should start looking at it now. And the few places that we do have it, like Markham, downtown Toronto, London, we should probably start to expand those networks as opportunities arrive, where we're intensifying the various neighborhoods in large cities to put in major transit corridors. Those are going to be easy to put in thermal networks because there's going to be a high enough density, and it'll help develop the technology here in North America so we can expand it into the lower density suburban areas. Europe is already doing that. Here, I think it'll take a little bit more time before we get both the manpower and the technology and supply chain to expand it beyond the high density urban intensification areas. But we should take a hard look at it, and if the numbers come out right, which I think they will, rely more on the thermal networks in the city for space and water heating.
Great answer. That's perfect. And there's another question. I'm going to take this question out of order only because it builds on what you've just said. Beyond that, what you just explained, do you see any other viable energy storage technologies available in the near future?
Well, it depends on what you mean by the near future. If you mean like tomorrow, the only energy storage systems that we have that will go beyond about 4 hours are hydroelectric, compressed air, and hydrogen. But each of those have its problems. Hydroelectric requires the right geography. Compressed air is not very efficient, and it typically can't get you more than 1 or 2 days because the heat that's stored when you compress and then return to the flow when you decompress can't be stored. High temperature heat can't be stored for more than a couple of days. And hydrogen, which is longer term, it can be stored for months. It's very expensive to produce, and the production process is very inefficient. Typically, the efficiency of a hydrogen storage system is below 40%. Compressed gas probably around 60, 70, and hydroelectric is closer to around 70 if it's pumped hydro, and 95 or 99 if it's a dammed hydro. But again, it requires the right geography. So there aren't a lot of choices for electrical storage. Thermal storage, if you keep the temperatures low enough, is possible. Long-term thermal storage is possible if you keep the temperatures below about 60 degrees centigrade. They're doing that in Europe in large community storage centers. They're just rolling them out now. So I think it would be good for the Canadian engineers to get themselves up to speed on what's happening in Europe on thermal storage systems, because I think that they're pointing to a way toward a cheaper way of getting net zero on low temperature heat applications, and we should be we should not only be aware of it, but if it looks good, we should exploit that technology ourselves.
Okay, excellent. So I was at a conference in September, and at that conference, I heard that they're building a hospital in Toronto. It's currently underway, and to regulate the heating in that hospital, they're actually going to be using wastewater, so
Yeah.
sewage, and
Yeah.
because that's constantly at a rate of about 18 degrees centigrade. So that's what they're going to be using to kind of regulate the heat in that hospital, and then offset obviously with some additional heating and cooling systems. But I thought that was kind of unique way of looking at new engineering methodologies to deal with this. So
yeah, that's right. That's what the Europeans are doing with their low temperature district heating systems, their generation 4 and 5 systems. They're taking waste heat from all kinds of people in the city and pumping it into the system, and then people that need the heat pull it out of there.
Yeah, that's great. Okay, I got two more questions. The second last one is, and you may not be able to answer this one, so if not, we'll just move on because it's more around concrete production. So how does the production and use of concrete impact achieving net zero carbon emissions? And what are the strategies for reducing that carbon footprint in the construction industry?
Yeah, I'm not an expert in concrete manufacturing, so I would be guessing based on some limited reading I've done. There are people that are working on various technologies, but I'm not an expert in that area, so I'd be reluctant to get into too much technical discussion.
Okay, fair enough. And perhaps Hamza, who asked the question, we're going to be redoing our sustainable cities. We're rescheduling that one because of a conflict with our speaker. So when we do that one with the Sustainable Cities Task Force, perhaps that's a good time to ask that question. So last question before we let you go. And again, thank you, Paul. So as you know, the provincial government is reconditioning some of our nuclear reactors and decommissioning some other ones. While those are off cycle or off grid, will we start to see an energy shortage in the next decade?
No, because the IESO is making sure that the energy is there when we need it. They realize this is only a temporary period until those reactors come back. So they've made a decision that they would like to use or lean more heavily on the gas plants. A temporary period of emissions. Now it's unfortunate, but we have one of the cleanest electrical grids in the world, and so increasing the natural gas use on a temporary basis to get through the refurbishment program, in my view, is not such a bad idea, because it's only a temporary emission, and it's still keeping us well below the emissions of industrialized countries like the United States, China, and India. So we're doing our fair share, even if we use more gas for a few years until the nukes come back. So I support the IESO's decision on doing that. There's no point shooting yourself in the foot during a temporary period if we have a good long-term plan, which we do. So we have a good long-term plan. Our current emissions are well below those of the United States, China, and India. So why are we so paranoid about using a little bit more of our gas to get us through this temporary period? Why do we want to take a risk at using much higher cost energy sources that will last for many, many decades, and we'll be paying those bills for decades? You know, we have to be a little bit more practical, because remember, we're a trading country, and 30-40% of our production goes outside the border. If we're not careful, we'll price our industrial sector out of the market, and then we'll have difficulty providing people in Ontario a reasonable standard of living. So we're already doing more than our fair share. Leaning on a little bit of gas for a few years is not the end of the world. I think the IESO have made the right choice there, and we should support them rather than give them a hard time.
Excellent answer. Actually, I lied to you. There's one last question. And this is from me. So again, we provide a platform for engineers to get involved, for us to steal their ideas, beg, borrow, and steal their ideas and their knowledge and experience. So if there are other people who aren't part of the task force, but are interested, how can they get involved?
Well, if they're interested in energy, I mean, we have several task forces, but if they're interested in energy, they can become subject matter experts if they know their stuff. If they just like to learn, they can participate as observers, I suppose. They would have to get a hold of the chair, Steve Pepper, and make their pitch. And if they make a good pitch, he'll bring them into the group. There's no limits now on the number of people that can be in a task force. The board recently removed that restriction, so we can have additional subject matter experts that contribute to the dialogue and reviews of the reports, and also people that want to learn can participate, read the material, and get up to speed. So you know, the door has been opened by the board for more people to get involved, but they do have to make a pitch to the the chair of the various task force they're interested in, and ask for an okay to participate in the meetings.
Perfect. And I can add a little to that as well. So one of the things that we also recognize is that our advocacy needs to go back to our members. It's not just to government, and to the media, but we need to educate our members and listen to our members and create platforms for our members to get involved. And one of these platforms are these task force fireside chats. We plan on doing a couple of them every year. So look for another one after the summer. And we'll update the group on the work that OSPI is doing in this space, an opportunity for you to ask some more questions. If you're interested in joining the task force or learning more about the task force, or you want to have a conversation with Steve Pepper, the chair, here's how you do it. You can email the OSPI team at advocacy@ospi.on.ca, or call the office and leave us your contact information, and then one of our policy leads will follow up on you first, and then make that introduction to the task force chair. And that's not just for energy, but any of the task forces. Paul, I'm so grateful and appreciative of the fact that you pulled off to the side and found a parking lot and joined us on this call and replaced Steve last minute. It just demonstrates what an amazing person you are. And again, you know, without any advance notice of what the questions are, I threw a bunch of questions at you. The audience did, and you were able to answer them fantastically. Thank you, Paul. Have a great rest of the day. Thank you to our members for joining in. Have a wonderful day, and we'll talk soon. Take care.
Thanks very much. Take care. It's a pleasure.